Well, thanks firstly to Penny for inviting me and for the introduction. Thank you for having me. And thanks to Alex for reminding us that actually sport is quite a small community. It took me back hearing about Alexander Usyk there to when during the researching of this book, I went out to Antalya, which, if you're not aware, is where all the Ukrainian Premier League teams go in their quite long mid-season break, of course, because it's a very cold winter. And they go out to sort of reanimate in January, February, get a couple of weeks training. And Shakhtar obviously stayed in the poshest hotel there, which had two of its own football pitches. And I stayed in the same very nice four-star hotel that the team that were ninth in the Ukrainian Premier League at the time did. But it reminded me of it because Alexander Usyk was out there playing for Polisa, big football fan, of course, and a real reminder of the facts. He went out there this winter as well about how close the Ukrainian sport community is as well, not just the football community. So just to give you a brief sum up of me, I've been writing about football, mainly a little bit of basketball here and there, but European football, continental European football, for about 20 years. But sometimes there's a story that just gets you and won't let you go. And in return, I've not been able to let it go either. And that's what Ukraine has been to me and what Shakhtar Donetsk has been to me over the last little while. Of course, if we go back over the history of Ukrainian football, it already starts with Kiev as the capital, as we know, still such a place of strategic importance for Ukraine, and I guess for Vladimir Putin as well, as he's escalated his hostility. And the interesting thing, I guess, if we go back and look at the history of Soviet football, is the fact that Kiev was the beacon, really. It was the part of Ukrainian football that said, not we are Soviet, but we are Ukrainian, for a long time before the Soviet Union existed. So if we go back between the years of, say, 1960 and 1991, Dynamo Kiev, they win the Soviet top league 13 times. That's more times than all the three teams from Moscow put together. So this was a way of Ukraine planting its flag really before it was allowed to plant its flag. And part of the reason it was able to do this was Valery Lobanovsky, who was a player, then an academic, then the greatest coach in the history of Ukrainian football. There's a stadium in the middle of Kiev named after him, the Valery Lobanovsky Stadium, which when I went to Kiev for the first time, I saw that. It's kind of how I imagined Ukraine to be before I got there. I guess like the first time I went to Sevilla in Spain, it was everything I imagined Spain would be. You know, loudness, food, flamenco. And funnily enough, when I went to the Valery Lobanovsky for the first time, it was everything that I imagined Kiev would be. It was cold, it was inhospitable, steep stands, an old style bowl with these looming sort of Johnny Edward Scissorhands sort of floodlights. And I loved it. I loved it from the first time I was there. But I guess my ability to be able to really connect with Dynamo Kiev was difficult because I speak a couple of different languages, but I don't speak Russian and Ukrainian. And I remember the first time I covered a Dynamo Kiev game, the players after the game, they come through this, after they leave the changing rooms, they come through this thing called the mix zone. And it's this little corridor, and it's quite informal. You just stop them and say, can we have a word? And they either say yes or no, or pretend to be on their phone. And I remember asking some of the other Ukrainian journalists, are there any of these Dynamo players who speak English? And someone said to me, oh yeah, Alexander Shovkovsky, the goalkeeper, who until recently was the coach of Dynamo Kiev, actually, he speaks English. So why don't you try and stop him? And so I just leant across the barrier as he came past and went, Alexander, do you have 2 minutes? And he turned around to me, and with the poshest English accent that I'd ever heard, said, "I'm afraid I don't speak very good English. I won't be able to help you this evening. Goodbye. Have a good night." I think he might have been pulling my chain a little bit. But I guess the reason I got this connection with Shakhtar is because I never really had that linguistic issue. Because Shakhtar, for going back 20 years now, have been a hub of Ukrainian footballers. That has been their model, told to me by people surrounding the club and people who work for the club, all set up by Rinat Akhmetov, the oligarch who took over in the 90s and has owned the club ever since, and the club has been his obsession. He wanted Shakhtar and he wanted Donetsk to be more European, more international. And the internationalism is where the Brazilians came in. Just like, I guess, lots of us talk about Pep Guardiola's style of footballer, Barcelona and Bayern Munich and now Manchester City, and how that's pervaded every sort of little area of football society. The fact that Guardiola's main thing is to get warmed up is the rondo, football piggy in the middle. And now you see Sunday teams play it, you see children's teams play it, and that's how much of a cultural impact he's had all over the world. And I guess Akhmetov and the people on the board at Shakhtar sort of imagined this for Shakhtar. They could never be Dynamo Kyiv because Dynamo Kyiv were Ukraine's team historically before the Soviet Union collapsed. But they could be something else. They could plant a flag for their part of Ukraine and for their club. And that's what they intended to do by becoming more international, really. And by bringing those Brazilians on board, it helped me make that connection with the club. I was out in Portugal covering some games. And the first time I did a Shakhtar game, they were away at Benfica. And they played beautifully. They were a junior Barcelona, and I was just this team that I wasn't familiar with at all, just had this personality. It was kind of like when Rodney Dangerfield comes into Caddyshack and you think, this guy's got a way loud shirt. What is he on? And it was a little bit like that. And fortunately, because they had so many Brazilians on the team, I spoke Portuguese already, I was able to speak to them and really communicate with them and ask about what the club was about and what they found themselves doing there. And they had a coach, a Romanian coach for over 10 years, Mircea Lucescu, who won them their first titles, who won them a European trophy for the first time in 2009 in Istanbul, the UEFA Cup. And he was obsessed with Brazilian football, and he spoke Portuguese as well. So he could bring the players in, understand their culture, help them settle in what was not a big city or what was not an international city, at least. I remember asking Fernandinho, who was the captain there for a long time, the Brazilian, before he went to Manchester City. When I first interviewed him, he'd been at Shakhtar for about 6-7 years. And I said to him, well, what if I'm a visitor to Donetsk, what do I do? Where do I go? He said, I've no idea. I never go outside. And the way the Brazilian footballers lived there, certainly through the first decade of the 21st century, is they stayed indoors, they wrapped up warm, they lived in the same apartment block together, they watched Brazilian TV and maybe a little bit of Portuguese TV on their satellites, and they did barbecues together. And it was a very close community. Now, of course, that worked for Shakhtar very well from a sports perspective. But I guess this was the next part of the vision for Shakhtar, that they wanted to open Donetsk up. So whereas they'd made it a little bit more cosmopolitan, they wanted to make it more part of things. So when we heard about music this morning and hearing about how you couldn't be just Ukrainian music, it should be part of a global conversation. It should just be great music. I think this is the way that Shakhtar looked at investing themselves in the world. And after they won the UEFA Cup in 2009, they already had a project going, which was to build their home, their own home, their new stadium. So moving away from that sort of Soviet image they had with the old stadium, the Olimpiski, and just across the road, just across the park in the middle of Donetsk, they were building the Donbass Arena. And if you've ever been past Tottenham Hotspur's new stadium, it looks a little bit like someone's just dropped a spaceship in the middle of London N17. And I guess this was the same in Donetsk, but even more so. It was an incredible modern structure. And this was back in 2009. And there were huge building challenges doing it. Of course, Shakhtar, it means miner in Ukrainian. It's a city with a history of mining. And that made building the foundations and what have you very, very difficult. But they got there and they built this incredible new stadium. When Akhmetov said, I want to make this 55,000 capacity, people tried to talk him out of it. And yet they filled it. And they filled it for big games, for big matches, when they beat the likes of Chelsea, huge games, and it was their home. But unfortunately, with the Russian invasion of 2014 into Donbass, it was a stadium they were in for less than 5 years. And this is really where I took up the story, what really intensified my interest in Shakhtar and the challenges that they were going through, because this is football's most famous homeless club. They've been on the road since May 2014. And I think what strikes me the most about this book, when I was rereading it on the train this morning, because I hadn't read it for a while and it needed to refresh my memory, it was the fact that the testimony and the openness of all the people involved, so the Ukrainian members of staff, the players, wherever they're from, is so arresting. And it's got a level of frankness that if you've worked in the sports industry and specifically in the football industry for a long time, people aren't that open. They're media trained. They always keep a little bit in reserve. They don't want to upset the club by straying away from the party line. And I experienced in dealing with Shakhtar, and still experience in dealing with Shakhtar, and always have had, a degree of openness and honesty that I really had nowhere else in my work, which I guess is really where this story has stuck with me. And one of the things that always stayed with me is Dario Srna from Croatia, who's used to be their captain, the most famous player, has served them for over 20 years, now as sporting director. Him saying to me about when they moved and the suddenness of it, when there was the escalation of violence in Donetsk. And the thing that struck me watching it on the news, I don't know about you guys at the time, was that the thing they built to show that they were part of the world, that they wanted to connect with everyone, this incredibly futuristic new airport, which after the big battle of the airport in 2 days just turned into rubble and is still that. And I think is quite symbolic of what happened to Donbass and sadly what has happened to Ukraine to a degree since. But I remember Dario Srna saying to me about the day that he left, and he got back to his house and he said to his wife and then one child, right, we've got to go, like, now, let's go. And he describes it and says he just walked away from his house. So his house is still there, his watch collection's still there, his shirts are still in the wardrobe, his car's on the drive. And this, obviously, people have gone through a lot worse, and people with less means, far less means, have gone through worse. But this really struck me because really in an industry when you're talking to people who've worked very hard to get where they are, but nevertheless are enormously rich and privileged in most situations, to speak to someone who earns several £100,000 a month, but says, I had to leave my life right there at the drop of a hat, and then I went and that was it, and I never went back. It's quite stark, and I think a reminder that war is just, there's no get out with war. You know, no matter who you are, no matter how rich you are, nothing can protect you from this. Nothing can protect you from this situation. And from there, Shakhtar became itinerant. The operations of the club moved to Kiev, and they trained and lived there. Akhmetov owned a huge hotel, the Hotel Opera, which we'll come back to in a second, where a lot of them stayed. And they would play games in Lviv initially. They were going to play, excuse me, they were going to play them in Kharkiv, and then MH17 happened. It freaked a lot of the players out, and they had to go way out west to play the games. And they went from a situation where they had a full stadium of 55,000 people to an almost empty stadium with 30,000 capacity, but with 3,000 people in it. Where, as Cerna said to me, you have the impression that most of the people hate you because they think you're Russian. And that really has been something that since Shakhtar have been on the road, I guess they've worked on, and they've needed to work on, like showing that they really are Ukrainian. Because a lot of people, the players have said to me, and people at the club have said to me, other parts of Ukraine, it's not really understood that Donbass, or some people in Donbass, want to be part of Ukraine still. Now, they'd almost found a sort of new normality by the time we get to 2022, because they've moved full time to train and play in Kiev. And it makes a massive difference to the players on a human level, because they're able to, rather than take 150 flights a season, they're able to just go home in 20 minutes after a game and see their kids, see their dogs, walk their dog, or whatever. And then, of course, February 2022 happened, and it goes back to that thing that I was saying before about there being no amount of money that can protect you from this. So when it all starts on February 24, they're all there hiding in the basement of Hotel Opera, and they're trying to find a way for the overseas players to get out. And Cerna, who had to leave his home when he was 8 years old, when there was war in the former Yugoslavia, who had to leave his home and all his possessions behind in 2014, did the same thing in 2022 as well. And he drove into Moldova. It took him 30 plus hours, and he had 3 of his coaching staff who he worked with and a spare tank of petrol in the back. And I guess really this is the point at which, against the backdrop of hardship and tragedy, Shakhtar sort of reframe themselves. Because from being a club that upsets the natural order of the things, a club that's not Dynamo Kiev, a club that's not Ukrainian football heritage and history and is thought of as a nouveau riche, that actually becomes a representative of Ukraine on the international stage. They go and play their Champions League games in Warsaw. And after that, because they're so well attended, they play them the next season in Hamburg. Of course, we know the Klitschko brothers have got great history in Germany as well, and connecting with the community there. And really, they become this sign that Ukraine can carry on, however difficult it is. And I guess that's why we ended up naming the book this. I had various other potential titles, On the Road, Far From Home. And then I heard one of the players say this, so we play on, whatever happens. And I stuck with that. And out of the biggest hardship, they were able to platform Ukrainian football in a completely new way. Because, of course, after the full-scale invasion, a lot of players left. They went back to Brazil, or went back to Spain or Portugal, or wherever they were from, partly because their relatives were really frightened, and partly because football stopped for a bit, of course. But once it restarted, they restarted in the Champions League with this completely Ukrainian team. And they've been building their youth academy over the years. And this is the moment where it all paid off. And so you have Mihailo Mudryk, who was really great in that first Champions League group stage of 2022-23. And really, he ended up keeping the club afloat because he plays a really good string of games. And despite being relatively inexperienced, is sold to Chelsea for 100 million euros. And that really keeps Shakhtar going. And we've had other ones come out of that youth academy. Someone who's actually from Donetsk, Anatoly Trubin, who you might have seen, the goalkeeper, scoring a diving header to beat Real Madrid and take Benfica through improbably to the next phase of the Champions League. the other week, and I spoke to Trubin about 3 weeks ago, and this was before the goal. I was there before he was famous, and he is a remarkable young man because he's only 24 years old. He made his Champions League debut away at Real Madrid during COVID times with no fans, and as a teenager, he kept goal as they won in Real Madrid. So he's got this interesting history with Real Madrid. But yet he's still very conscious of the fact, like all Ukrainian footballers are, that they are flying the flag for something, that it means something more. And it's funny because we hear a lot of people in football say all the time that sport has the power, football has the power to mean something, to raise people up. Normally it's Gianni Infantino, the president of FIFA, saying that, and it's completely empty. And a lot of the time it feels to me completely empty when people say this. But actually with this, it does mean more, because every time they're doing this, they are putting Ukraine on the map. When Trubin scored that goal, he's putting Ukraine on the map. When we're at a point where we're coming up 4 years on and headlines move on, people become desensitized to it. But these guys, crass as it may sound, are actually, via sport, keeping Ukraine in the forefront of people's minds. And that's really, really important. As for what this experience did for me and continues to do for me, I thought about this when I was flicking through the book this morning. And of course, when you're a journalist and when you're a broadcaster, whether it's written or oral, it's choice of language is so important all the time. And I think sometimes because we're on this massive content train, it's easy to forget that. You know, the old phrase that we used to use probably way before most of you were born about, you know, today's headlines are tomorrow's fish and chip paper. That definitely still counts in the digital world. But this really made me look at things, because all of these cliches that even the most erudite football writers use, like it's a battle that we fight, that this defender is someone you'd like next to you in the trenches, that this person is a hero for scoring a winning goal. All of these are like really, actually quite empty epithets, really. And it's made me, all these years on, much more careful about how I use language. Like, it's been a disastrous fix. No, it hasn't. It's been disappointing. It's definitely not been disastrous. But the experience of writing this book, I don't know. I'm not sure I can ever get around to writing another one, because 3 or 4 books down the line, I'm not ever sure there'll be another one with this much meaning. And these guys they continue to inspire me. Thank you.